It's funny how sometimes the language we use to just survive in a certain situation, at work maybe, or in a new social group, isn't actually the language that gets to the real truth of who we are. We think of language as just, communication. But when survival's on the line, it becomes this really crucial and sometimes compromising political tool.
That tension is exactly what we're getting into in this deep dive. We're looking at a field of study that's basically moved past the point of having to prove it even exists.
Right.
So the argument isn't if this different pattern of thinking is real anymore. It's become who gets to name it and, under what conditions. It's a journey from fighting for proof to asserting freedom.
And for you listening, our mission here is to really unpack that shift. We're going to explore this move from what the sources call a bridge term, a necessary piece of survival language, to words that claim a whole, coherent orientation.
An inherent logic.
Exactly. We are diving into the intellectual shift toward what's now being called the whole memory mind. Okay, so let's unpack this. To really get why the shift was so necessary, we have to start at the beginning with Gestalt Language Processing, or GLP. When that term first came on the scene, what was it really pushing back against?
Well, it was pushing back against this really deeply entrenched idea that there's only one, quote-unquote, correct way for language to develop.
The standard way.
The standard analytic part-to-whole way. Traditional models assume you build language like Legos, you learn words, you memorize grammar rules, and then you snap them together to make new sentences.
Right.
GLP described a completely different, almost inverted process. Whole-to-part meaning-making.
Okay, let's make that really concrete for everyone listening. Can you give us an analogy? How does that actually look different in practice?
Sure. Think about learning a skill, like a new language. The analytic learner is sort of like an engineer. They get the textbook. They memorize all the little parts, the verb conjugations, the vocabulary lists.
The building blocks.
The building blocks, exactly. And they very carefully assemble their sentences piece by piece. They care about the underlying structure.
Okay, and the Gestalt learner?
The Gestalt learner is more like a musician who learns by ear. They don't bother with the grammar textbook at first. Instead, they just soak up these big, meaningful chunks of language from the world around them.
Like what kind of chunks?
Oh, anything. Phrases, song lyrics, whole scenes from a movie, routines. And they use those full gestalts to communicate right away. And only later, maybe, do they start to break those chunks down to see the individual words inside.
So the Gestalt learner is using an entire prepackaged script. And that script carries the meaning, the context, even the emotion, whether or not they understand every single word in it yet.
That's it. And that is a huge difference in approach.
It is.
And for years, if you didn't follow that expected analytic path, if you were repeating phrases or using language that was tied to a specific context, you were often just mislabeled.
As having a failure of development.
Yeah.
Or some kind of rote deficit.
Exactly. So GLP was absolutely essential because it finally gave a name, and with a name comes legitimacy to this coherent whole-to-part process. It proved this was a real functional system of learning.
And the sources really hammer this point home, that GLP was a necessary bridge. So why was it so critical to use this specific kind of clinical language at that time?
Because it let this communication style be seen as a valid process for acquiring language, not as a cognitive failure. It brought real lived experiences into professional fields, bridging this huge gap between what parents were seeing and what, say, a speech pathologist or a teacher was trained to look for.
It basically created a common currency, a professional language everyone could use. So parents, teachers, therapists, they finally had a shared vocabulary. And maybe more importantly, it opened doors to support and resources that were just unavailable to people whose brains didn't fit that standard analytic mold.
And that recognition, just being able to say, this isn't a failure, this is a distinct, real process, that did monumental work. It affirmed millions of experiences.
Yeah.
But, and this is the core of our deep dive, success at that stage led to the next crisis.
The limitations of the bridge itself.
The limitations of the bridge.
And this brings us right to the heart of the critique, this idea that proof has a cost. When you're forced to argue for your own legitimacy inside a system that wasn't designed for you, how does that start to compromise the language you're using?
Well, when you enter a system that's designed to measure and treat deficits, which, the traditional models were, the language you use has to meet their threshold for approval.
Right.
You're forced to describe your reality in their vocabulary, and that almost always reduces or narrows the complexity of what's actually happening so you can get in the door.
So if the system really has boxes for processing or deficits, you have to frame your own way of being as different processing, even if the reality is so much bigger, like a whole different cognitive orientation.
Sure. That's the core issue. The sources say the language starts to bend around their thresholds. You end up choosing terms for survivability rather than truth.
Wow.
GLP, by focusing on language processing, it stayed within a clinical framework. It was concerned with output, with acquisition. It effectively ignored the deep cognitive architecture that was driving that language style in the first place.
So Gestalt language processing became, well, as the source puts it, a piece of survival language. It was useful, it was provisional, but ultimately it was boxing in the whole concept.
Oh.
It's like using a temporary dirt road to access a construction site when you've just finished building a 6-lane highway.
That's a perfect analogy for the distinction. Survival language it's essential to navigate the bureaucracy to get the resources, but it becomes a conceptual cage if you stay there too long.
Right.
The real goal is to find language that reflects your internal truth. It's about self-naming.
And I think this idea of survival language is something everyone can connect with, outside of this specific topic. Think about corporate jargon. We all learned the survival language of the boardroom. We talk about synergy and leveraging assets.
Driving deliverables.
Exactly. Because you need that jargon to be taken seriously in that culture.
Right. But that language almost never describes the actual messy human truth of what's going on. It's a kind of translation fatigue. You're constantly translating your own reality into a language someone else made up.
Yeah.
And the critique here is that by calling this Gestalt language processing, you're only looking at the tip of the iceberg, the linguistic output. You're missing the cognitive roots. The shift is arguing that the difference isn't just in how these people speak, but in how they think, how they remember, how they know the world.
So the problem with the GLP bridge was that it kept the conversation locked in a narrow clinical box. And now the time has come to, I guess, dismantle that bridge and build something permanent.
Absolutely. The argument is shifting from I process language differently to I am oriented differently. And that's why this new terminology is so important. It's about finding freedom without permission.
Okay, so what does that new freedom actually look like? If we're moving past the bridge, what are these new naming conventions that assert that internal authority? How is a full Gestalt orientation being defined?
This is the really critical expansion. We're moving from describing a single process to defining an entire system. This shift lets us finally recognize the inherent internal logics, timings, and ethics of this way of being.
Instead of just defining it by how it differs from the norm.
Exactly. For example, the timing of language acquisition. For Gestalt learners, you see these seemingly sudden, massive leaps in ability. That looks strange from an analytic perspective, but it makes perfect sense if you understand the underlying cognitive structure. They've been absorbing the wholes all along.
Let's really drill down on the key new term here, the one that tries to capture this whole identity, the whole memory mind. Why is memory the star of the show now, and what does moving from processing to mind really accomplish?
It just expands the scope so dramatically. A Gestalt orientation it's deeply memory saturated. It's context dependent. When language is learned in these whole chunks, those chunks are encoded with everything, not just the sounds, but the emotional state, the sensory input, the environment, the visual memory of that exact moment.
So it's like a holistic, multimodal file being saved. The information's richer, but it's also fundamentally tied to its surroundings.
Precisely. The meaning isn't abstract. The knowledge is the moment. The whole is always primary because the memory itself is the foundation of the thought. And this foundational memory system, it can allow for this extraordinary ability to recognize patterns, subtle shifts in the environment, things an analytic system, which strips information down, might totally miss.
That distinction really sells why GLP felt too narrow. Processing feels like an operation, a function. But mind suggests an entire complex architecture built on this holistic memory.
Yes.
And it also explains a key challenge, doesn't it? Why a Gestalt learner might have a hard time generalizing a phrase outside of the exact context where they first heard it.
Exactly. If the original context isn't there, that multisensory memory network that supports the phrase is it's harder to access. It's not a failure to apply a rule, which is an analytic task. It's a failure to retrieve the contextual memory that gives the chunk its meaning. The whole memory mind is built for what the sources call situated coherence.
Situated coherence and context-saturated knowing. You mentioned those. Could you expand on what those mean?
Yeah, they really capture the mechanism here. Situated coherence just means that what you know is coherent within its original context. Knowledge isn't abstractly portable in the way analytic systems assume. For the whole memory mind, the logic is tied to the physical and sensory world.
Which is so different from analytic thinking, which is all about stripping away context to create universal rules.
Right. And then we get to Gestalt sovereignty. Now that term, it feels like more than just a cognitive model. It sounds like a political or ethical statement.
It does.
And it is. It's a declaration of self-rule. Sovereignty is about asserting your own inherent legitimacy. Moving toward Gestalt sovereignty is basically saying, we're done seeking your validation. We don't need your permission to define our reality, and we're not going to use language that compromises that reality just to get access to your systems.
It's the ultimate form of self-naming.
It is. It demands that this orientation be understood on its own terms.
So this completely flips the conversation from that original problem. It's no longer about defining yourself by how you deviate from a system built for analytic development. It's about being understood as a complex, coherent, and legitimate system in your own right.
It shifts the entire focus. Instead of constantly trying to compensate for difficulties with standardized analytic tests, you can start to appreciate the unique strengths of this holistic, contextual, memory-driven intelligence. It affirms that the whole is always primary, and that includes the mind itself.
This whole deep dive into terminology is just, it's such a profound reminder. The evolution of names in any field, from Gestalt language processing to whole memory minds, it's so much more than just an academic update. It reflects this really universal shift from fighting for external recognition to asserting your own inherent legitimacy, your own self-definition.
It really mirrors the intellectual journey of overcoming a history where your reality was defined by an outside force. One of the sources describes this as the unlearning of a colonized mind.
Wow.
Which means doing the deep work of shedding the language that was put on you from the outside and reclaiming the right to define yourself accurately. It just highlights the absolute necessity of self-naming.
Because when we let systems built on someone else's logic name our most fundamental experiences, we inevitably lose clarity, we lose power, and we lose pieces of our own truths.
But the whole process is about clarity through freedom.
Right.
And if we accept that the real intellectual battle isn't about whether something exists anymore, but about who has the authority to define it, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought.
Consider your own life, your own knowledge. What crucial parts of how you function, your experience, your way of being in the world, are still being named by someone else's system? Whether that's professional jargon or social expectations or just outdated ways of measuring things. What would you call that coherent core of yourself if you were finally free to name it?